Question number 5, the Honourable David Parker.
My question is to the Minister of Finance. What is Treasury's projection for New Zealand's current account balance for the next 4 years?
The Honourable Steven Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, as a percentage of GDP, the forecast current account deficit is 3.6%, 5.4%, 6.4% and 6.9% for each of the March years 2013 to 2016. The main contribution to this is a short to medium term lift in imports due to the Canterbury rebuild. This impact is expected to make up almost a third of the forecast current account deficit in the year to March 2016. Other factors include a Treasury expectation that export prices will come off record highs, a forecast increase in business investment and an increase in consumer confidence. It's worth noting that even the 2016 forecast deficit is currently it would remain significantly lower than the 8.9% peak it hit in 2008.
The Honourable David Parker.
Does the preview in fact show that even excluding the Canterbury rebuild, the current account deficit will increase to 5.2% of GDP, or $13 billion in 2016?
The Honourable Steven Joyce.
Mr Speaker, as I said in the answer to the primary question, that the preview does predict the deficit to increase for a number of reasons, and the Canterbury rebuild is the biggest but not the only one. Although I must say it's reasonably amusing to suggest that suddenly Mr Parker is much more focused on the Treasury predictions today after bagging the Treasury predictions yesterday.
Order. The Honourable David Parker.
Supplementary.
Yeah, the Honourable David Parker.
In other words, is the Minister confirming that under the national government's economic settings, Treasury projects the current account deficit will get worse every year of the forecast period, rising to $17 billion in 2016?
The Honourable Steven Joyce.
Mr Speaker, in relative terms that is the Treasury's prediction, and the government is actually more optimistic than that, but the member makes the mistake of starting from a very low position, which this government has actually contributed to improving it from the very bad position that the previous government left it in. Between 2005 and 2008, the current account deficit averaged more than 8% of GDP each year as government spending grew out of control, consumers went on a borrowing binge, and the productive parts of the economy were squeezed out by red tape and new costs. It's now got down to less than 2% in 2010 before it's expected to rise back from that as a result of the factors I mentioned in the primary answer.
Simon Bridges.
What reports has he seen on the current account balance?
The Honourable Steven Joyce.
As I alluded to, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, the previous answer, the balance of payments has undergone a dramatic improvement in recent years, falling to less than 2% in 2010 before rising slightly to its current level of around 4%. And this is mainly because New Zealanders have started saving more and borrowing less. It's also as a result of improved economic policies, particularly around red tape and not adding new costs to business. And of course we know that that's what happened to the export sector under the previous government when the internationally competitive parts of our economy went into recession in 2005 because of the policies of that government, and we've been in the process of reversing them.
The Honourable David Parker.
Can the Minister confirm that the growing current account deficit will be paid for by a combination of New Zealand borrowing more money from overseas and the sale of more New Zealand-owned assets to foreign buyers?
The Honourable Steven Joyce.
Mr Speaker, the answer to the second part of the question is no. The answer to the first part of the question is interesting because actually again we have a situation where New Zealand's net international liabilities have dropped significantly since this government has come into office. It's dropped to 69% in the year to March 2011. It peaked at 85% of GDP in 2009 March, just after Labor left office and ahead of National's first budget. So we've improved the net international liability position. Treasury have some projections going out which suggest it'll come back a bit, but it's nothing like what happened under the previous Labor government that member was part of.
The Honourable David Parker.
If the growing current account deficit will not be paid for by a combination of more borrowing from overseas and the sale of New Zealand-owned assets, how will it be paid for?
The Honourable Steven Joyce.
Mr Speaker, the current account deficit and the international liabilities position, two of the things that will impact it is improved savings by New Zealanders, which I am pleased to see have occurred. Well, that means that you can have... Well, Mr Speaker, the savings of New Zealanders are very important in terms of New Zealand's net international liabilities, and also the export performance of New Zealand businesses. In an answer to an earlier question today, I pointed out that the investment by companies in New Zealand, investments that are going to grow exports, are picking up as a result of this government's interventions.
Order. In fairness, before I go to the next question, the member did ask how the current account deficit would be paid for after certain outcomes of savings or would be funded after the outcomes of savings and exports. And I don't believe that question is perfectly capable of being answered because the government must have some idea of how it plans to fund the current account deficit, and I believe the House does deserve the answer.
Mr Speaker,
Steven Joyce.
The point I was making was that the government doesn't accept that the Treasury's projections in this matter are final, and the government is working hard to improve the export performance of the New Zealand economy so that the current account balance does not go out to the extent that the Treasury projections expect.
Forgive me, but it would be a miracle in my time if the government succeeded in turning around projections from 6% of GDP to 0% of GDP. Therefore, a current account deficit does have to be financed. And I believe the member deserves that part. You know, the question was very simple and very clear. It did contain no accusations about bad policy or anything like that. It just asked how it was to be financed. And the Minister describes how the government plans to try and minimise the current account deficit. That's fine, but that's not what actually the question asked.
Well, Mr Speaker, obviously to the extent that it isn't met, in other words, the foreign accounts aren't in balance, then international liabilities do rise, and that's the point I suspect the member was making. The point that I was making was we didn't necessarily accept that those projections as they provide by Treasury are likely to occur, particularly if we improve the settings around the export sector of the New Zealand economy. That was the point I was making. I think it's an entirely fair point in the context of the current account balance and the international liabilities. I was responding to the question.
I thank the Honourable Member. I thank the Minister. Simon Bridges.
What steps has the government taken to rebalance the economy towards savings and exports?
The Honourable Steven Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, the government has taken several steps to rebalance the economy towards savings, investment and exports. As the member knows, we've reformed the tax system, increasing taxes on consumption and property investment while lowering the tax rates on working and saving. We've set a faster return to surplus in 2014-15, one of the most important contributions the government can make to lifting national savings, and one that the opposition rejects. We've kept a lid on the costs of doing business by getting on top of fast rising costs like ACC, which are due to reduce in the next couple of months. And we're providing investment opportunities through the mixed ownership model that will help Kiwi investors diversify their growing pool of savings away from property and finance companies. Mr Speaker, it is just a pity that the opposition don't sometimes listen to orthodox economic policies which balance the New Zealand accounts and grow the New Zealand economy.
Order. The question was from the Minister's own colleague. Don't need to bring the opposition into that. Question number 6, Nikki Kay.
Mr Speaker, question to the Minister of